Please welcome your panelists for Energy Markets, the Year Ahead for Oil, Gas, and Renewables, moderated by the Wall Street Journal's Gregory Zuckerman.
See?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a little hard to see you, but hopefully everyone can see us well. My name is Greg Zuckerman. I'm a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and I'm really thrilled to be here. We've got a really interesting panel, a nice mix of experts from Wall Street and investors and producers and major producers and foreign as well as domestic. So it's a great privilege, and I'm excited to be here. What I thought I'd do is ask everyone first just introduce themselves rather than I do it, and give us just a little sense of what your focus is and what you're excited about this year. You want to start us off?
Great, thank you. I'm Helima Croft. I'm head of commodity strategy at the Royal Bank of Canada, and I'm particularly focused on the geopolitics of the oil market.
Great. Josh Harris, co-founder of Apollo Management. We're a $250 billion alternative asset manager with a very large private equity and credit effort. And we're really focused on North American E&P, North American midstream, and also lending to middle market energy companies.
Bernard?
Bernard Looney. I'm responsible for BP's upstream business. That's our exploration, development, and production business around the world. We operate in 27 or so countries and very focused on the energy transition at the moment.
Hi, I'm Michael Smith. I'm the CEO, founder of Freeport LNG. We're building a 2 BCF a day LNG export facility to take about 2.5% of the U.S. Natural gas to foreign countries who don't have access to clean-burning natural gas and hopefully supplant dirty-burning coal.
Nice, in places like China and elsewhere, which would be quite helpful. So I first thought we would lay out where we are in the oil markets, obviously, and in energy broadly. A year or so ago, things were kind of down in the dumps. People worried in the industry about where profits would come from, and then suddenly things have kind of surged, and now we're about $70 a barrel. I thought we'd discuss kind of why we are where we are, how we got here so fast, and I think my colleague to my right maybe will start us off. And is it sustainable? We've kind of surged. We're at 70. Can we stay at this high level?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be much more constructive on oil prices. I mean, I think one of the things that people didn't anticipate a couple years ago was the willingness of OPEC to stay the course on the production cut. And we thought of OPEC as a very dysfunctional group of producers that would cheat at every opportunity. And we've seen tremendous discipline of the OPEC producer cartel working with Russia, which was something entirely new, to basically drain the global inventory overhang and bring it down to the 5-year average. So they've been actually very successful in doing the whole rebalancing strategy. Now, they've been helped by the fact that some of the countries that are the traditional cheaters within OPEC, like Venezuela, their production is dropping like a lead balloon because of the internal political and economic problems in that country. Like Venezuela is actually the most compliant OPEC country today. They're like 200% compliant. But also, the demand picture is actually very, very constructive as well this year. So we're looking at demand growth of 1.6, 1.7 million barrels a day. So even with a very healthy U.S. production story, when you have the backdrop of strong demand plus OPEC staying the course, and then other key producers seeing these very large production declines, as well as renewed concern about the Middle East, potentially having a snapback on Iran sanctions, I think that's the mix that got us to where we are now.
Were you surprised by this surge, and did you call it?
Yeah, we could have called it. I mean, I follow geopolitics, so it's not something that we were surprised by. One of the things that we were surprised by, actually, was this view that was prevalent last summer when oil was selling off very sharply post-OPEC meeting, that shale would be the forever Superman, that U.S. production could make up for any major outage in another producing state. And this is a year that shale is really being put to the test with that. And so I think we were surprised that people weren't paying enough attention to how unstable and how stressed these sovereign producers were by a prolonged period of low oil prices.
It's worth pointing out that even though oil surged up to about 70 or 68, that the back end of the curve is still, at 53. And I think we're also pretty constructive on long-run oil prices, even though the curve doesn't reflect that, because we just think that the decline curves of the major basins will require, and demand growth will require more supply than will be generated either out of the U.S. shale or out of OPEC. And I think the OPEC has succeeded in, setting back the bigger projects by creating enough volatility in the market that some of the bigger oil companies are having now to live within their cash flow. And so, but I think you have to look at the curve and say, like, what do they know that we don't know? And there's a lot of uncertainty in the back end of the curve. There's a lot of things that we might consider to be red herrings, but you talk about electric cars and other things. But I think you have to look at that shape of that backwardated curve and really think about what the market is saying to you. And I think there's still, notwithstanding our view or Atlanta's view or anyone's view, there's still that uncertainty in the market about where oil is 5 years from now, which is what you really need to bank on if you're doing some of these projects.
So that tells you perhaps people are thinking about peak demand kind of thing when you look at the curve?
Well, that's not a sensible thing to say over a 5-year period, but it just tells me that people are saying, okay, maybe there's a recession coming, maybe there is a slowdown in demand due to electric cars. Maybe there's ride sharing. There's nothing you can really point your finger to that should be creating a $50 price of oil on the back end of the curve. But yet
it's there.
It's there, and so you need to really, there's this uncertainty in the market that I think will keep supply constrained. And I think, so in a strange way, even though OPEC probably didn't expect the U.S. shale to snap back the way it did and to push back and to continue to generate production, it sort of has, in a weird way, won and created a situation where you've got high short-term prices and low long-term prices that stifle supply and sort of creates higher long-term prices over time.
It's kind of fascinating that they tried to kill the frackers and they didn't succeed, and yet they got what they wanted, higher prices. Bernard, love to hear your perspective.
Well, I think as they say in the business, if you want to forecast the price of oil, you should forecast often. And I think that's the reality. I think none of us really know. It's not that long ago when oil was $27. Now it's at $75. Brent, people are talking about $300. Who knows? We're focused on running our business with the things that we control. Ultimately, that's the cost structure. This year, we've brought our break-even down to about $50. By the time 2020, 2021 comes, we expect that break-even to be between $35 and $40. That's resilience, and that's what matters to us. The price of oil will be what the price of oil will be. Our job is to maintain discipline and drive that break-even down such that if it is higher, for all the reasons that we've just said, there'll be excess cash for shareholders, and if it's not, we're ready for it. In terms of, you mentioned peak demand, and I think this is a very interesting subject, of course. One thing for sure is there is not peak energy demand. We forecast, and I think everyone forecasts energy to increase by 1/3 over the next 25 years or so, another Europe and another China combined. Peak oil, I think our chief economist in London would say, very complicated subject. It is. The slightest change in any assumption can move that date by a decade or two. And he would also say it's not particularly interesting, and I'm not sure, in a very British way, I'm not sure I would agree. People are very interested in this, but maybe just one quick scenario on this one. If we talked about electric vehicles, there's about 2 or 3 million electric vehicles in the world. We ran a scenario that said 2040, by the time now in 2040, the number of kilometers driven in the world will double,
As middle class,
absolutely,
India,
as explosion in
China.
prosperity, 2/3 of people, or 2.5 billion people, be moved from low to middle income. If we assumed for a moment that 70% of those kilometers are driven by electric vehicles, 70%, that would mean 1 billion electric vehicles on the road in 2040. oil will be at a higher level of demand in 2040 than it is today. Why is that? Because electric vehicles, light-duty vehicles represent only 20% of the oil market. People think it's a much bigger number, it's 20%. There's going to be massive growth in marine, aviation, and heavy trucking over the next decade. And in the decade after that, oil as a source of industrial products is going to be on the rise. So there's a lot of myths out there about this energy industry, and I think that's just one example that says this is a product that's going to be in demand for a long, long time to come.
I guess that presumes that trucking won't switch over to electric.
Well, trucking may very well do that, but I think it's enormously challenged. I think we're seeing a lot of gas now being pumped into heavy-duty transportation. So there are opportunities out there, but the facts are the facts that even in the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, which takes the world to 1.5 degrees, the world needs 85 million barrels a day in 2050, and that is an extraordinarily ambitious target, 1.5 degrees.
But just to underscore what Bernard's saying, no matter how you look at it, it's very hard to see peak demand in oil anywhere in the next 20 years. And so, again, it's like hard to make sense of the curve, right?
Well, we had peak oil. That didn't work. We had peak demand. And when is it? 30 years? 1 in 3, we're going to all be Elvis. Okay, right? So that's what projections, for those of you who were there for the lunch session. So, long-term forecasting is so inaccurate, and in the energy space, it's not even in the planet. They get it wrong all the time. Other than there's 1 billion people who do not have electricity around the world. They want a share of what we have, and they're going to get it over time. And the 2.5 billion people who from low income to middle income, every facet of that requires energy. And that energy is going to come predominantly for the next 20, 30 years from fossil fuels. I really hope that renewables can take over sooner than later for the good of our planet. But for my lifetime, and certainly for my time in the industry, it's imperative that we're able to meet the demand through fossil fuels. I, of course, would rather see it natural gas, which is the cleanest burning fossil fuel.
Well, we'll get to that. While we stay on this subject, a little bit of projections to the extent we can. Yes, a decade ago, America was running out of oil and gas, and now we're exporting it. But let me go back to Helima. If one determines that the most important factors of this rise have been things like the growing economy, geopolitical tensions, bottlenecks in the Permian, which of those will continue, which won't, if one can make those kind of predictions?
I mean, I think one of the things to watch for, we have a constructive story that we've laid out, and I think that the issues about bottlenecks in the Permian, those are things that can be overcome over investment over several years. But I do think there are these still kind of from a bearish standpoint, what would worry me would be the trade war talks. There are things like that could really ignite a macro sell-off. But things to have to just keep bearing in mind is that we still need these sovereign producers to produce. And the US has really been the only area that has been growing. We've been living off of legacy investments in places like Kazakhstan and Brazil, and we need the investment in these additional projects. So that is the problem with the curve in terms of what you've talked about. It creates this phantom liquidity. You don't get the investments that you actually need. And if we think about where future demand growth is going to come, it's going to come from places like India. India will surpass China soon as the center of demand for oil and energy. And so the question is, who's going to fill that gap? And so I worry about the lack of investment going forward.
And OPEC was able to kill some projects, right?
Well, now what's interesting is, they certainly, the curve has worked for them, but now they've come up with a new target of targeting investment. Now, some say that gives them the ability to continue to cut production going into 2019. But that is when you talk to OPEC officials, they say that that is their big concern, is the lack of investment in these, conventional long lead time projects.
Yeah, OPEC lost the battle with the shale producers and the frackers, but they sort of won the battle with the big integrated oil companies and the significant holes that they were drilling, because it was too volatile to predict, and the price curves didn't allow for the right ROI. So the real question is, given the decline curves, if you've got to replace, and a little bit of demand growth, not a lot, if you got to replace 15 or 18 million barrels over the next 5 years, how do you do that? And even if shale knocks the cover off the ball and does way more than everyone expects, and OPEC increases its production, you still need some of these projects. And when you look at the projects that are on the books, it doesn't look like enough. And so ultimately, unless the demand scenario changes and there's a recession, you kind of can see this future higher price coming, because the world's just going to run out. Supply demand will be out of balance. And what happened was during the when oil prices went down, is inventories went up. And now inventories are sort of back down to normal levels, and then you can look out there and say, and it's hard to envision a scenario where inventories stay at where they need to be. And so it really does feel like ultimately prices are going to go up.
Wow, everyone's quite bullish on this panel. Bernard, are you guys as well?
Well, I think the only comment I would make around the levels of investment, because Michael and I were talking about it earlier, and there's no question that the IOCs have cut back on levels of investment, but I would not underestimate the productivity improvement, shale aside, completely aside, that we have seen in the last 3 to 4 years. Case in point, we had a project in the Gulf of Mexico called Mad Dog Phase 2. In 2014, at $100 oil, its cost structure was $20 billion. Today, it's between $8 and $9 billion. Same project, same reserves base.
Can you give us an example of how is it?
This is not what everybody thinks, which is that the supply sector has been held up against a wall and beaten to a pulp, so to speak. There undoubtedly have been robust conversations with the service providers, but what really has been at work here, and we believe that 75% of the savings are sustainable, and by the way, we don't believe we're done, is through a completely different mindset around how we work. So a tiny, tiny example of on that facility, these facilities today are covered by Wi-Fi. Typical oil field answer, what's the maximum coverage? 5 bars, the entire place gets 5 bars. Well, actually, in a cost-constrained world where you really do worry about your margin, you do it a little bit more sophisticated than that. We put 5 bar in some areas, we put 2 bar in other areas, we put 0 in areas that didn't need it. We save $1 million a year. Tiny, tiny example in a multi-billion-dollar project, but that's the sort of change that is happening in the sector. We haven't even begun to talk about digital and what is possible there. These are transformational changes. So yes, the industry is investing less, but I, for one, believe that I wouldn't just say that $1 in 2014 is the same as $1 today. I think you're actually getting more for it. Certainly true in the shale sector, but also true in places like Deepwater.
It's interesting. People think of technological innovation. They think of Silicon Valley or East Coast. It's the energy revolution. It's all about technology. Anything you want to share in terms of what you guys have done embracing technological innovation?
Digital is, I wouldn't want to overplay it, but I do think it's an absolute game changer. We have one of the world's largest non-military supercomputers in Houston. It's 9 petaflops. I don't really know what that means, but it's 9,000 trillion calculations per second. We recently discovered a 200 million barrel field within a field in the Gulf of Mexico with an algorithm that in 1999 would have taken 1,000 years to run in the computer. It ran in 2 weeks. That is transformational, and we're just at the beginning of understanding what is possible in digital. So I think it's pretty exciting in terms of what's possible.
And that would suggest maybe there's a ceiling on how high prices can get.
I think time will tell, but I come back to the point that we don't control the price of our product. We don't influence it. What we do control is our cost structure. That's what we're focused on, the resilience, and let the price be what the price will be.
So Michael, I thought I'd ask you about, unless you want to continue this conversation, I want to ask you about renewables. And we all, I think, broadly as citizens, want to see a transition. And the way it was sold was that through natural gas, it would be a bridge to a better future where we could rely, and our kids can rely on sustainable fuels. Tell us whether that's happening. Tell us how fast that could take place, or whether you're skeptical of that kind of transition to a renewable world, or we're more dependent on renewables.
Well, I don't know that I'm the expert on the panel on renewables, but as far as the natural gas being the bridge to whatever year renewables can finally make the impact and reduce the need for fossil fuels. The natural gas demand around the world is growing faster than any fossil fuel. And I think one of the driving impacts recently, because we're talking about what's happened lately, and the panel is about what's going to happen in the next year, so let's not talk about years past, but in the past year, we've seen a transformation, what's happened in the liquefied natural gas business. And I think the Paris Accord, which was something we were going to talk about, and one of the reasons we're talking so heavily about renewables, because we do need to reduce our carbon footprint, is that it has spurred demand throughout the world, and especially in China. China viewed liquefied natural gas, which was way more expensive than coal, as being too expensive, and they were a sleepy, small consumer of LNG relative to their size and their energy needs up until a few years ago. Low prices brought out more demand, but President Xi became president for life, and if you've been to Beijing and have seen how polluted it is, he also decided he wants to live a long life. And that means getting off of coal. 2 years ago, China increased their LNG imports by 33%. Last year, they increased their LNG imports by 48%. They went from a small LNG buyer a few years ago to number 2 in the world. They will surpass Japan as the number 1, who's still twice as big as them, within the next 5 years. It will not shock me if it's in 2 to 3 years. And it's a great fuel. Natural gas produces half the CO2 when you burn it than coal, and it doesn't have any of the particulate matter. So it's clean burning for the skies in Beijing and for everyone's health, and reduces the carbon footprint. So for countries that need electricity, and solar is not going to be the answer, or wind is not going to be their answer for the foreseeable future due to climate, that just doesn't work for them. They have to burn natural gas if we're going to reduce the carbon footprint. And the only way to deliver it for countries that do not have indigenous supplies is through LNG. And we see a huge increase that's going to occur in the LNG demand market over the next decade.
Can I just say, in the U.S., so renewables, we've looked really hard at it all. It's about 10% of the U.S. right now in terms of power production, but it's just, there's the economics of it just don't really work without, even post-subsidy, your equity returns are in the low to mid single digit. And
all types of renewables.
I mean, everything is different, but like wind, solar, but generally speaking, the equity returns are subpar. So it ends up being driven by tax credits and by people with big losses who can use the tax credits. And so it's not that it's not going to go up, it'll go up, and maybe technology will change it, but it's hard to really, and it'll take a bite. It'll just sort of, right now the biggest way to clean the air and clean the skies is, the change between coal and gas. And gas will continue to grow. I think what renewables will do, it'll create some regional imbalances in pricing on gas, where these things get regulatorily mandated, such as here, which, by the way, might be the appropriate political, but it's not going to be driven by economics. And then ultimately, it'll just speed up the decline in coal, but it's likely not to slow down very much the growth in gas. And truthfully, natural gas is still the way, to clean up the environment as quickly as possible.
So you're saying in 2018, a smart investor like Apollo still doesn't see the economic benefit of investing in sustainables and renewables?
Private equity's been killed by renewable investments. The wind doesn't blow. You kind of do all these studies, and you convince yourself the wind's going to blow, and it doesn't blow how you think. Solar, it hasn't really worked without really significant government tax credits, and generally, like I said, those are driven by people with big losses that can use them right away versus to buy down the price versus over time the way we would use them.
I thought they were going to
Greg,
develop.
let me just say one thing. One thing, a little known fact that people don't realize unless you're in the energy business, and someone tells you about it, because I was in the business a long time, I never even realized this, that intermittent sources, like you said, when the wind doesn't blow, if you're, for consumers who are striving, we need to get clean energy, and we want wind and we want solar, but we want low electricity prices. Of course, it takes a lot of money out of your budget. Well, the fact of the matter is, a utility who has to provide energy on the coldest day of the year, or people will die, there is no margin for error, has to build a hopefully natural gas plant to back up every one of the intermittent sources of energy. So you have a great solar plant. There's a power plant that's been built so that when the sun goes down or the wind doesn't blow, the people still can turn on their lights.
No, but what's really happened is the peaker demand, which was the way many utilities were able to make below average profits in their core business. On the hot days, right, the peaker demand for gas would be enormously cash flow accretive. And I will say what's happened, I think, with some of the renewables is that it's created enough capacity where that demand is basically being shut down. And so it's actually put when you look at the average power price and you look at the peaks, they're no longer really significantly accretive, so it's changed it.
I thought the goal, the hope was that batteries would advance to the extent that you didn't have to have everything wind blow all the time and the sun shine. Do you know, Bernard,
Well, maybe before batteries, if I could build a little bit on what Michael and Josh have said, and I would agree with them both. Non-hydro renewables today in the world are about 3% of the world's energy. Now, we project in our forecasts that renewables will grow at 7% per annum through to 2040. Now, just to put that in perspective, that's the fastest penetration of any energy source ever in history.
Wow.
It took from 1900 to 1973 for oil to go from 1 to 44% of the world's energy market. It took from after World War II to today for gas to go to 24% from zero. We're growing in our forecasts, renewables at 7% per annum. Even at that extraordinary rate, they will reach between 25 and 40% of the world's power in 2040. And they will not drive emissions down. Why? For the reasons that have been said by Josh and by Michael. The cost of providing backup to intermittency is non-linear. As the penetration of renewables grows, as we feel better and better about the penetration of renewables, the cost of providing that backup actually goes up exponentially. Batteries don't seem to be on the pitch today, and it's difficult to see a battery breakthrough on that scale. Gas is available, as Michael says. It's clean and it's affordable. And by the way, this is coming from a company who has a large wind business in the United States. We have enough wind power here to power 400,000 homes. We have a massive biofuels business in Brazil, producing 750 million liters of ethanol from sugarcane a year, and we have just bought into the largest solar developer in Europe called Lightsource BP. But I do recognize much of what has been said. It is a challenging space. Gas seems to be the only way, and I would argue is beyond a destination fuel or a bridge fuel, but actually more of a destination fuel for the future.
Let's turn a little bit to the investment outlook and opportunities out there. I'll turn to my colleagues to my right. What has you excited? What's the last investment you guys made in the space?
Yeah, so what we're finding a lot of investment in is pretty much backing the so-called wildcatters that are accumulating acreage. So the shale, right? When OPEC started this the funding games 3-4 years ago, the shale, the break even for the average, we were buying oil reserves in places like the Permian and lower cost basins where we could break even in the $50 to $60 a barrel, and our long run forecast was 80, and the price was at 100. So then, OPEC took the price down to 30. A lot of stuff got distressed, and we tried it. We bought a little bit of that, and so now with the price at 50 to 68, depending on we kind of look at the long run price and where we can hedge. The shale, to the points that have been made, took its, we're buying stuff that's economic at the well level in the 30 to 40 range. Like, so that, what's happened is that the shale, there are now at places in the shale such as the Permian or the Scoop, where you're competitive with the lowest cost regimes in the world. And so what's happening is that we're putting together, the plots of acreage are too small for really major oil companies to really bother with at this point. And so what you do is you literally accumulate acreage, and then you swap or you buy adjacent acreage, and you try to create enough drilling continuously that you create a real company that's large and significant. And we're doing that in the oil world, in the various low-cost basins, and in the gas world in places like the Marcellus, where you've got gas that's economic at $1.50. Or other prices and so we don't really, at the end of the day, we see the supply-demand imbalance coming, but really what we're trying to do is create downside protection where we're able to produce in very, very low-cost areas where, okay, if the price of oil stays at 50, we're making a decent return. We have a lot of optionality to the upside, and then we have downside protection because we don't believe the price can go below 50 for very long. Because at that point, most of North America becomes non-economic, and eventually, prices will adjust to that. So that's kind of what we're doing. I mean, midstream has actually been very pricey. The private equity returns on midstream, where you want to earn a 20% rate of return, you can't do it even with leverage. So
it never really came down as much either, right?
It didn't. People view it as a different risk, and it's become much more like infrastructure, and so it's hard for us to play in that. But we're doing a little bit of it, and then there's gas compression and things like that. The gas boom, is creating a lot of need for compression and other services, and some of that goes into the zone of private equity.
It's remarkable you talk about shale as a low cost basin because historically it was the highest cost. It's challenging, it's deep, all that kind of stuff. So it's fascinating how things have changed. Please share your own thoughts.
No, actually, I work with sovereign producers and I'm in strategy, but one of the things I actually think is really interesting is we talked about the sort of demand for gas in places like China and India going forward. I actually think what's really interesting is looking at what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, now you actually see a number of key Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, making and looking to shale plays in the United States to basically for gas. You see these deals going on because they need gas for power generation, and so I think that's interesting to see the kind of deals that have interesting geopolitical implications. Like, for example, if Saudi Arabia, Aramco, was going to invest in Arctic LNG 2, the Russian projects, like what type of gas deals that have really interesting geopolitical consultations? I mean, we talked about the world for gas, but that does raise really interesting implications about what does that mean for Russia's role? As Russia remains a dominant gas producer, what does that also mean for Russia's sort of global influence?
Yeah, let's talk about geopolitics for a little bit, because the rise of the United States as an energy power has all kinds of geopolitical implications. Bernard or anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think we were talking a little bit earlier, a lot of people are saying, what about when the US surpasses Russia in terms of production and so on? Actually, if you include natural gas liquids, the US surpassed Russia in 2014. The real question, I think, becomes, and is already becoming and becomes, when does the US become a net exporter? It is exporting today. I think it is still a net importer. But the question becomes, is the difference in balances of trade that's happening around the world. So for today, China is the #1 importer of US crude. What does that mean for geopolitics? And I think we can already see some of this playing out in US foreign policy. And I think with increasing production from the shale, that's possible, not guaranteed, but possible. And what Michael is doing with exporting LNG around the world, because Dima is absolutely right. Gas is becoming a massive issue in the Middle East, and you will help solve that. So I think interesting times ahead.
Yeah, I would like to just take, I mean, one thing I think has actually been, the whole shale revolution and the idea that shale is Superman, I think allowed policymakers to be a little bit naive sometimes, that we didn't have to be as concerned about developments in the Middle East, about what is going on in places like Latin America. Like, I actually think Russia was driven by the low oil price environment to do this deal with OPEC. I think they have gained enormous global influence. Like, the premise that sort of Russia being, the US supplanting Russia would be meaning they would lose influence. I see Russia ascendant in terms of their global influence. I basically look at Russia and say, they are now the lender of last resort to Venezuela. They have essentially become, the key patron of this country. If you look at Russia's role in OPEC, while there's a question mark, are they going to continue to cut 300,000 barrels a day? I do not see them stepping back from having a leadership role in that organization. You see Russia doing all these deals in Kurdistan. You see Russia doing deals in Libya. So I think actually Russia has been able to turn what started as an energy deal into a trade deal with some Middle Eastern countries, but able to project power into some of the most distressed oil-producing states in our backyard. So I actually think that Russian influence has risen because of the low oil price environment, because of the types of deals they did.
I just don't think it's necessarily economically sustainable. I mean, certainly politically it's true, but the question is long run. The U.S., I think people talk about this a lot, but the reality is the U.S. still needs 20 million barrels of oil, and it's making 10 on the way to 13. So it's no question that if you go back 5 years ago, we were in sort of deep straits relative to our dependency on nations that, might be complicated to deal with. And I think certainly shale has changed the balance, and maybe in 10 years we'll be a net energy exporter, 5 to 10 years. But I don't think that. And I think certainly China, right, and India need oil, right, and they're sort of getting into the same position that the U.S. was in 5 or 10 years ago before shale. And certainly Russia has done a really good job of, in many ways, you didn't mention Syria, both in and out of the oil patch, of creating value in terms of its, kind of presence around the world. But I think that, I don't know that you've seen, I think these are very long run trends, and I'm not sure that it's really, the U.S. still needs the Middle East. We're still a net importer of oil. We still need, the supply-demand balance is still very tight. And, kind of without the Middle East, you could see a massive spike in oil prices. That would not be good for the U.S. It won't be as bad as it was 5 or 7 years ago before shale, but I think it's a little bit overblown when people talk about it.
Josh, I agree with you, but I do think that the increase in U.S. production and the decrease in the amount of oil we are importing has allowed us to make choices and pick different countries of where we're getting the crude from instead of having to take it from Saudi Arabia.
Agreed.
So they got pushed out, which started this whole thing because they got pushed out and they couldn't, their market share was getting hit in China, and they wanted to make sure that they didn't lose market share there. And it gave our former and our current administration more options than we have if we were just starved for oil like we had been forever, for 30 years.
And actually, when I started my career at as an intelligence analyst after 9/11, and I can tell you that we were very focused from a U.S. government standpoint on diversity of supply, because we didn't want to be so dependent on the Middle East. We never thought we'd have this abundant resource in the United States. And so actually, the countries we were really focused on was growing production of West Africa. And we thought about a country like Nigeria, which at the time we were taking 10% of our imports from Nigeria. We hoped to take more. And we thought Nigerian production could grow from 2.5 in 2001 to 4 million by 2010. It never happened. But also, what shale really did was displaced countries like Nigeria. Oh. That's really where those countries were hit, the imports of light sweet crude. And so I think from a foreign policy perspective, we didn't have to care anymore about Nigeria from an energy security standpoint. And so it didn't command the attention of policymakers. But Saudi Arabia, because of the barrel, I mean, we still, on all of the anchor state for the Middle East for US policy, we still have to care about Saudi Arabia. But it's countries like Nigeria that were really the victims of the shale story.
Because they produce the same type of crude.
They produce the light sweet crude. Yeah. They were the product that got permanently displaced.
Interesting. Bernard, I'll ask you this question. The Paris Accord, on the one hand, many countries around the world still care about it and are focused on it. On the other hand, our own country, we've got an administration that's much less concerned about those kinds of issues. As a major, as an international major, how do you decide on policy, and what is your direction? Because again, we're getting indications in our own country that you don't have to worry about those kinds of issues.
Well, I think just a fact around gas, just for a moment, in terms of the United States greenhouse gas emissions are back at 1990 levels. 1990. So one of the extraordinary stories in terms of environmental impact over the last couple of decades has actually been the United States. And the reason that has happened in the United States is because coal is down by 40%, being replaced by gas going up 20%. So actually the United States is an interesting story around environmental performance amongst the world actually over the last 20 years or so, enabled by gas. For us, we certainly are a supporter of the Paris Accord. For that to happen, emissions around the world have to come down by 50% between now and 2050. Current trajectory, even with some of the extraordinary things that we talk about, have emissions growing 10%. We have a very, very simple framework that we have laid out about what we are doing, and it's a global response. First of all, we intend to reduce our own emissions, and we're working on that. So even as our company grows over the next decade, we intend to hold our emissions flat. That's the first thing. The second thing we're doing is improving the products that we sell to, so that our customers and the consumers who use our products, and remember that 90% of the emissions come actually through the consumer using the product, can be improved. So we're going from 45 to 55% gas over the next 4 or 5 years. 21 of the 30 projects that we started up between 17 and 21 will be gas. And as Michael eloquently said, gas is half the emissions of coal. We're also investing in biojet. We have an investment in a company here in the United States called Fulcrum that turns municipal waste into biojet with 80% less carbon footprint than conventional jet fuel. This is an extraordinary growth business. The airline industry has said that they will reduce emissions by 50% by 2050. They're going to have to do things like this. So we want to improve our customers' products. And thirdly is create. We do want to create low carbon businesses. We're actively involved in doing that. I spoke about our solar, wind, and biofuels business, but we're also investing in companies like Solidia. 5 to 7% of the world's emissions come from concrete or cement, 5 to 7%. This is a company that's found a lightweight way to create cement that reduces the emissions by 70%. We're investing in companies like that to see if we can make a difference in the world. So we have a very clear framework. It's about reducing our emissions, it's about improving our products, and it's about creating new low-carbon businesses. And I think that's good for a global company.
Why do you care about carbon footprint, given that the biggest consumer in the world doesn't, or at least the administration, isn't as concerned?
Well, we care about it because a lot of people in the world care about it. A lot of the countries that we work in around the world care deeply about it, and quite frankly, our employees care about it.
Nice. I'm going to ask Michael a question, but then I'm going to turn it over to Q&A. So get your questions ready. Michael, you're obviously a bull on LNG. Give us an an argument for why it's going to continue despite kind of the challenges, but also what worries you or what could be a cap on the growth of the LNG market? Is it infrastructure? Is it embrace from countries? You tell me.
Well, LNG demand has doubled each of the past 10 years, each decade. When oil prices cratered, it came at a time where LNG plants around the world were sanctioned, and the largest building of LNG plants in history were all being done in Australia and the United States. And they were all supposed to come online pretty much in a short period of time. And we were going to have a global glut just when LNG, which is priced off of oil prices go down. It was a double whammy. So it was believed that with low oil prices, the LNG growth would not be sustained, and we had a terrible situation for our industry. That's what happens with projections in our business. In a little over a year, we've gone into a situation where, and I was on a panel here 2 years ago when it was $40-something oil, and it couldn't go past 50, 55, and the Permian was going to do everything, and I was looking at that. I've been here before. After 37 years, I've seen the movie before. It's going to 70. It's going to 80. I have no idea when, and I didn't think it was happening this year, quite frankly. And with $70 oil, and I believe higher than that, let me go back to 50 first, but higher than that over time, LNG from the United States is the lowest priced natural gas that can be provided other than pipe gas. So we have a great opportunity in the United States. LNG demand, based on almost all forecasts I've seen, your CEO has talked about a potential shortfall in as little as 2022 if new facilities aren't sanctioned immediately this year. These things take 4, 5, 6 years to get built. And I see that we're going to, what I believe, especially with what we're seeing from China, we'll see another doubling. It may take a little more than 10 years. By 2030, we could see a marketplace that's 294 million tons last year to upwards of 600 million tons, which would be great for the environment. But it's great for the United States for additional LNG facilities that can be built, creates tremendous amount of jobs, and helps balance our trade and balance the deficit of importing oil and now exporting all kinds of fossil fuels.
Okay, go long Freeport and Cheniere and those guys.
Yeah, well, I'm private, so you can buy Cheniere. I think they're a pretty good company.
The debt, you can buy your debt.
Yeah, so.
I'll turn it over. I've got more questions, but I'll turn it off to the audience. If there are any, we'd love to take them. On the right, or my right.
Hi. Mexico undertook an energy reform recently. I wonder what are your thoughts regarding the economic impact and the geopolitical impact? They're supposed to be getting over $200 billion in investment.
I mean, I can start on the geopolitics. I mean, one of the things we're watching very closely is really what happens with the upcoming Mexican elections. I mean, to us, we're very focused on, what would a López Obrador look like in terms of Mexican energy policy, in terms of some of the things that he's talked about in terms of capping investment, new restrictions. I mean, that, to me, is one of the material election risks that we're looking at for the energy markets, is really what happens in Mexico. So I am concerned that we could see some of those reforms that have been very important stalling out on the back of an election there.
We were very focused on Mexico in terms of building a team there and beginning our relationships there, and we've had to slow down a bit during the dialogue between the U.S. government and the Mexican government. It made it a little challenging for us to really lean into it, but we see a lot
Even
of
the back and forth that affected your investment decisions.
it does, because you don't really know ultimately, what the trade regime and the tariff regime and what these regimes are going to look like. And so if you're going to invest a lot of capital, and then now that we have to raise money from public institutions on both sides of the border, and so the political overlay affects us. And so it's not that we see a lot of potential in Mexico, but we've just been a little bit waiting on the sidelines to see how it all susses out.
We're investing. I mean, we've taken the reforms head on. We've entered the offshore. Last several license rounds have been successful, and we're entering the downstream market. So we've got about 150. I think it's growing every day now, maybe 200 retail sites, BP retail sites, as they've liberalized the downstream sector. So it's an area of huge opportunity, and as you said, Dima, I think we'll be keeping a close eye on the elections.
Okay, I'll take another question from the audience. Think over here.
Yeah, I can't believe all you oil guys haven't thought about the future of nuclear energy. Thorium power. Never heard of it, huh? It consumes radioactive waste. It is not weaponizable.
All right, go along. What's it called? Thorium?
Thorium
Thorium
power.
sounds good. Bernie, you probably are most likely expert.
Here in California, you can't use the word nuclear.
It's a shame, right? It's great for the
You
environment.
could use thorium power and get rid of the waste in San Onofre.
Well, sounds interesting.
Okay.
Bernard?
Now, how about hydrogen for protecting the grid when cyber attacks deposit? Now, I also know of a friend who's generating rocket engines, but he's from Costa Rica. He says the whole economy of Costa Rica is hydrogen power.
Okay, let's hear the experts address some of those points.
Well, I think if I'm the expert, I think that's a challenge. But, I think that the real answer, and there are many sources of energy out there, I think our own learning over the last several years, and we've got quite a bit of experience in this, and quite frankly, we've learned a lot of hard lessons in this space. We went through the Beyond Petroleum phase of BP. I think the key lesson for us is that what the world needs is a race to lower emissions, not a race for renewables, or not a race for any one particular source of energy. What we need is to be in a fight to drive emissions down. And to drive emissions down, we're going to need carbon capture and sequestration. We're going to need renewable energy. We're going to need gas. We're going to need nuclear. We're going to need energy efficiency, a huge opportunity, 50% of the 50% available out there in efficiency gains alone. So that's what the world needs. It needs us to fight on an emissions front, which will involve all types of energy sources, rather than focusing on any one particular energy type.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on any of those points about nuclear or hydrogen? Okay. Thank
you, Greg.
Sure thing. You're the expert. Anybody else? We got another question here.
Thanks. I wanted to ask a question about how the downstream is going to evolve in the energy transition, especially from a potentially geopolitical perspective as well. You see Saudi Aramco investing heavily in India. You see Russia, especially Rosneft, investing in India as well. And how does the downstream outlook, especially on the refining side, look like in terms of the switch and actually in terms of the future of oil demand? And then the second issue actually is related to US refiners and in terms of the future of growth coming from predominantly light oil. And actually, there's quite a problem at the moment with light-heavy differentials, especially with Venezuela and then the OPEC cuts. how is that going to affect the refining margins of US Gulf Coast refiners?
Yeah, we didn't talk too much about the downstream. You want to take a shot?
Well, I'll take the sort of geopolitics of it. I mean, I think that was one of the sort of clear lessons. With OPEC initially, when they took a cut on cutting production, they just went for, let's go for maximum volume with price, and it basically killed their finances. I think they are now looking for captive markets. And so I do think that that is a clear strategy. You see it, with Saudi Arabia, you see it with a whole host of producers to try to do these partnerships with China and India to lock in captive market share. So we joke that the market share war hasn't ended, it's just evolved in terms of these partnerships. But just also in terms of strategies going forward, I mean, if you think about what Abu Dhabi National Oil Company talks about, they talk about now petrochemicals, they talk about downstream. You have the Aramco talking very heavily about the future being downstream petrochemicals. So I think that's also how they see themselves as national oil companies evolving in terms of strategy.
So we have 6 seconds left. So I think we'll end it here, but I'm sure the panel will be glad to take more questions one-on-one afterwards. Let's thank the panel.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.